Os doy la bienvenida a un nuevo episodio de Librísimo, el número 5, esta vez con la autora Lisa Tuttle, que nos acompaña para hablar de Mi muerte, su última novela en español traducida por Regina López Muñoz para Muñeca Infinita Editorial. Lisa Tuttle nació y creció en Austin, Texas, y se trasladó al Reino Unido en la década de los 80. A su primera novela, Refugio del viento, que co-escribió con George R.R. Martin, el autor de Juego, de tronos, le siguieron una docena de novelas para adultos y jóvenes de fantasía, ciencia ficción y terror, así como cientos de relatos cortos premiados y recopilados en diversos volúmenes como son Nido de pesadilla, Recuerdos del cuerpo o Futuros perdidos. En Mi muerte seguimos los pasos de una autora norteamericana que se queda viuda y que intenta recomponer su vida escribiendo la biografía de Helen Ralston, conocida por ser la modelo de Circe, un cuadro muy popular en los años 20 del siglo pasado. Te invito a que escuches nuestra charla, que se desarrollará en inglés con subtítulos habilitados en español. Hello, we are here with Lisa Tuttle. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Christina.
Thanks so much for coming to Librisimo. This is our fifth episode, and I'm very, very happy to have you here with Mi muerte, My death, which is your upcoming book. I think it just came out in Spanish.
It just came out a few weeks ago. Yeah.
It's with Muñeca Infinita Editorial. Translation by Regina López Muñoz. And I wanted just to say that in the beginning so I don't forget, because sometimes we forget about the translations, how important they are. You should never forget the translators and the publisher. And the first thing I normally ask everybody who comes to Librisimo is, why the title?
Well, there's a strange story about that. I had read... there's an American poet who was the muse of the poet and writer Robert Graves. Her name was Laura Riding. And there was kind of part of the inspiration for the story of my death was about, a kind of a muse figure and an older man who was. Mm-hmm. So I had read this biography of Laura Riding, and I thought that I read, there was a scene where the two of them were traveling they left England together, and they went to live on Mallorca. Uh-huh. And that the story was that as they were sailing into the harbor, wherever, and they could see Mallorca, and that she kind of gasped and said, "I have seen my death." Mm-hmm. But that it wasn't like it wasn't a negative thing. It didn't mean she was going to die, but that it was somehow symbolic. Mm-hmm. Well, the weird thing is, when I actually came to write and so I thought My Death would be a great title. Mm-hmm. So when I actually came to write the book, I was looking for it because I wanted to give a quote from this biography. Mm-hmm. So I got it, I had it from the library. So I checked it out again, and I could not find it. And I read about their arrival in Mallorca, and I was looking through it, and I thought, well, maybe it was something else, because I'd read a biography of Graves. Nope, it wasn't there. Was it in a memoir that someone else had written? Well, I'd read a couple of those. No, nowhere was it mentioned. And I was asked about this, a couple of years ago when the New York Review Books was going to reprint My Death. And I was interviewed by the Amy Gentry, the American writer who wrote the introduction to it. Mm-hmm. In the American edition. And she asked me about my death, and I told her this. And she then said she just spent ages looking for it, because I said, I can't find it, but it's, Anyway, the last time I spoke to her, I said, I've started to think I must have just dreamed that. And she said, yes, Lisa, that's what I decided too.
Isn't it wonderful?
It doesn't seem to have happened. So I think I must have I actually do think I probably had a dream. And that dream sort of stuck with me. And because this book, like a lot of things I write, I was thinking about it for a long time before I wrote it. And I had a lot of different ideas for it. And I recently, I was going through some old notebooks to try and get rid of things. They're just cluttering up the place. And I opened one, and it was from, I don't know, about 2005 or something. And there was this on one page, it had my death in quotes, and then underneath, it was about this idea for a story, obviously, that was about a girl who in high school, her boyfriend tells her there's a picture of her, a painting of her in the city museum. And she goes and looks at it, and she's not sure if it really does look like her, but she makes a note of the artist's name, who she'd never heard of. And I was going to somehow develop her search for the artist into a story. But I don't know why I thought it would be called My Death, but that was obviously something I thought of before I actually came to the story.
And
so it's odd. I don't know.
But I think, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but I think it suits very well the story, and you have to read the story because there is a why. There is a why this is connected so much, more than you think. Yes. And the story, as I mentioned in the introduction, talks about a woman of I would say few decades into her life that has lost her husband. She's from the States. She lives in Scotland, a little bit like you yourself. And she's a writer, and she gets kind of like obsessed about this artist that it's not that well known, but for some reason she adores and admires, and decides that it would be a great idea to write her biography. And things start becoming kind of funny, spooky a little bit, because there's a lot of coincidences. And then I thought about, well, you yourself were born in the States, moved into the UK, now lives in Scotland. So how much parallelism is between the story of My Death and your own life?
Well, there are some things, and it was almost like a kind of game, there were certain things that were true. But then, I mean, fortunately, my husband is still alive. I'm not a widow, as the character is. But there are things. I mean, I grew up, the kind of, I suppose, her journey in geographical terms is very like mine. That, I think I had her growing up in Texas. I can't remember now. And then she goes to university in New York, which I did. And then she goes to London and she meets her husband, and then they move together to Scotland. And all those things are true of me. But other things are just, they're fantasies, or they were for that character. And I don't think I ever named her.
No.
Because in a way, I wanted her, the readers might think that it was almost an autobiography, that I was writing about myself. But I never have anyone call her by her name. And indeed, the books that are referenced that she wrote, that she sees on a shelf, and could be my books. They're sort of, it's so, yes. So she's quite close to me. Yeah.
And in fact, I was going to ask you why the main protagonist doesn't have a name. And I think you just answered that. That was one of my questions. Why? And I think it's a very intelligent game that you're playing with the reader in such a way that you include the reader in the story in a way. And I thought that was a very nice thing to do, and very difficult to do it well, by the way, I must say. But coming back to the story and the genesis of the story, you mentioned that you were thinking about this story for a long time. Do you remember more or less when and where were you when you thought about it for the first time as a novel?
That's hard because, as I said, when I came across that notebook and I saw it was a different story entirely. And in fact, I remember a lot of the details of how it was going to progress. And she was going to find, in that story, she was going to find something that appeared to be the journal of the artist. But anyway, that's another thing. I actually started on that, and I wrote pretty much a draft almost of a novel, but it just wasn't working out. So I put it aside. But as for what did become My Death, I'm not really sure. I know what was the kind of impetus to write it was I was invited by Pete Crowther, who runs a small publishing company, a small press called PS. And he had decided, I can't remember what exactly he was publishing, mainly kind of fantasy, science fiction, horror, genre works. And he decided instead of bringing out like a short story collection or a novel, he was going to do some novellas, some very short novels. And he invited me to write one. I can't remember how many had been published before he got to mine, but at any rate, he invited me. Would I be interested in doing that? Oh, yes, I thought that would be a great way of because it can sometimes be difficult when you're thinking about how you're going to sell something. If it's a short story, there's certain markets. If it's a novel, that's a different thing. But the novella, where a lot of publishers would think it's too small, too short, it's not long enough to publish, but it's too long for the anthologies and the magazines that want short fiction. So I thought, well, that's good. And I thought, oh, I did have this idea about a woman who starts researching another writer. Yes, I think that will be it. And I began it, and this is very unusual. It's not the way I usually work. I usually work on my computer, my laptop. In the old days, it was a typewriter. But this one, just after I was starting to sort of work it out in my head, I was going to London, and I was going by train. And I'd reached the point where I wanted to start writing this particular book. So I just brought a big notebook with me, and I wrote the first, I'm not sure how many pages it ended up being. It was probably about 20 or 30 pages in the notebook, but maybe the first 10 pages, maybe a little longer. I'd have to look at it and see, maybe to the first point where there's a kind of break in the text. And I never do that. Or I very rarely have done it. And it just seemed, which is why it begins by her sitting with a pen in her hand on a train.
Yes.
But she also draws, which I don't do myself. I have no talent for visual art. But anyway, so that was when it began. And I didn't know at that point how it was going to end.
Oh.
So I surprised myself.
And is it this something, I was going to ask you this later, but now that you mentioned this, is this something that it normally occurs to you, or you're normally a person who knows exactly how the story is going to end? Or it depends?
I rarely know exactly how.
Okay.
I often know roughly where I'm aiming. I have to say, sometimes it just happens. I have the beginning, I have a situation, and I just start going, and I see where it takes me. And that was pretty much what this was. I didn't really have it worked out. I knew certain things I wanted to happen in the story, and I knew about the characters, but I really came up with the ending quite a long way in. I was starting to get, how do I end this? How do I? So yeah.
And would you say finding the ending was the most challenging in this project?
Probably, yes. Yes.
Was it something that it was the hardest to write?
I don't know if it was the hardest to write, but it took me longer to reach it. I sort of got to a certain point where I was just, I kind of knew how the, what would you say, the muse character, I knew where her story that I was going to tell, where it was going to end. But I didn't know how the narrator's story was going to end.
Okay.
You see what I mean? So it was, so I was thinking of various possibilities, and, I could do this and I could, but anyway, eventually I think I made the right decision. And of course, sometimes when things work, you do feel like, well, that was the only way it could have ended. Or at least I hope readers would feel that way. It was the way when I eventually got there, I thought, well, of course, that's how it has. I mean, there it is. And sometimes things, when I'm writing, it's like, particularly in longer things like a novel, as opposed to a short story, where I feel, well, I could go on. And sometimes even in short stories where I think, yes, but I don't have to end it here. I could have this happen and then this happen, and won't that be a stronger ending and also a longer story? So, so endings are, I always tend to think that starting is easier than finishing. But frequently I make the wrong start, and then I go back, oh, no, I've started in the wrong place, so I either cut it or I have to start earlier.
And do you remember roughly how many versions of the text you have before it was published? How many?
Oh, well, probably not that many, because the point is, before word processors, it was very easy to see how many drafts I did.
Of course.
But now there's the writing and the rewriting as I go along. Because very often, particularly if I'm kind of getting a bit stuck, I would go back to the beginning and start making changes. And sometimes one of those changes was something that had to be done so that the story could progress. Otherwise, I would carry on being stuck. So it's hard to know. I would say maybe, I'm pretty sure there were at least 2 full drafts effectively.
Okay.
Like with a different sort of ending, or ending in a different place. So at least 2, maybe 3. But all the little and of course I had written the beginning by hand, so that I had to type it out, and I always make changes when I start doing that. So.
And I also found very interesting the whole setting in Scotland. I wanted to know how much importance has Scotland in this story.
I think it is very important. It's possible to, I don't know, I suppose it would be possible to reimagine it as taking place, I don't know, somewhere else, except to me, it is very much, I think it kind of had to take place in Scotland. And there were things like kind of connections with mythology, and with like the very fact that there are these little islands off the coast, the west coast, which were often either they were the homes of hermits who lived there by themselves and became saints maybe, or they were funerary isles where they would row them out, they would row the body out and then bury them there, and no one lived there. So that to me is a very evocative kind of thought about an island where only the dead occupy it. And it's there is some sort of connection with kind of ancient Greek mythology. That was one of the things that Robert Graves, of course, he famously wrote a lot about the Greek legends and Roman history as well. And so again, that was having a character who was interested in mythology. And a painter who did these sort of paintings like of Circe and various, other kind of Greek mythological figures. I don't know, it just seems, and I also felt that, partly it was because I am an outsider who came to Scotland, and now I'm Scottish because I've been here for a very long time, but that I wanted the characters to I wanted the American element as well. Although that could possibly be changed. It didn't have to be from America, but they would have to be someone who wasn't from Scotland, who came to Scotland, I think. So, yes, I think, and I think the landscape does inspire me. The West Coast is, in particular, it's just it's just so beautiful. And it's, you know, it's the sea and it's islands and distant mountains. It's, I love it. I love it.
And the art also. If we talk about Glasgow and you know the art that is there and the many artists that were connected to Glasgow and to not only painting but sculpture, architecture, it's very well known.
Yes.
And I always think it's risky and is provocative to write about artists and other fellow writers. So you are a writer who's writing about so you are a writer. You're writing about another writer who's writing about another writer. So it's very interesting. And most of the characters and the main characters are female. So men appear in the story, but they're not the most important part. I wouldn't say they have that importance in certain episodes of the woman in the characters, the female characters in the story, but they're not the main focus. And I really like that the women were not accessories. And I was wondering if that was a conscientious decision. You always thought about the main character being a female writer in this time of her life?
Yes, I mean, I think, well, I tend to write about, more often than not, I write about female characters. And I mean, so part of it was kind of being the narrator in a way myself. Of course, it's going to be a woman. But I just, as a reader, as well as a writer, I like reading women's stories about women's lives. And I've always had a fascination growing up. I always wanted to read about women who were writers or women who were artists, women who did things, mainly creative things. I mean, I liked reading about male artists as well and male writers, but especially about women, just because of knowing particularly in the past, all the particular struggles they had on top of everything else. I mean, you may read about a male artist who starts out, he's very poor, or no one believes in his talent except him. And so he's got his struggle. But then you think about every woman who's ever managed to do anything she's had on top of all that. You know, she might also be poor. She might also, but she would also, for many, many centuries, would just be told, you can't do it. Women don't do art. You can be the subject of art. You know, a man will write about his great love or he'll paint you and make you look even more beautiful than you are. But you know, it's just, this isn't what women do. So even though, I mean, things have changed, you know, and far more books now come out by women writers and are taken seriously. But it's still, I just feel there's something there that, probably just being a woman myself, you know, I'm just drawn to that, I suppose.
And also the fact that you were also speaking about this earlier, about the concept of being a muse, like that you always direct the reader towards the woman, Helen, and her life and the things that happened to her and how strange they came sometimes. So I wanted to ask you, for me, it's a familiar territory, but for most people, what you write or what you write about, it's very difficult to label. And I would like to know if maybe you don't want to label it, but if you had to tell in which genre or subgenre is this story, My Death can be framing, what would you say?
Well, I suppose I would call it a strange story, but it's also it's something that I've actually throughout my career that I've kind of struggled with, because when I started out, I was sort of identified as a science fiction writer. Now, I haven't written very much what I would call science fiction, but at the time that I began writing, back in the 1970s, when I sold my first stories when I was still in college, science fiction was the genre that encompassed fantasy, all of fantasy, and a lot of what I wrote, though, were ghost stories, or would be called ghost stories, because it was hard to find another label for them. I mean, Robert Aikman, is one of the ghost story writers who inspired me. And I think he sort of referred to his as strange stories because they often don't have ghosts. And sometimes they're classified as horror stories, but they're not always that horrific, but they're always strange. They can be quite weird. That's another thing, it seems like in more recent times, like maybe the past decade, the weird has become, definitely recognized.
The new weird.
I think I'm a weird writer as well. So I would say it is weird, but it's also quite, I mean, I really, what I like to write is I like to make it quite realistic and quite believable so that when the strangeness or the weirdness happens, you're really kind of taken aback, but you also don't you question it, but you think, oh, well, there must be some explanation. We're going to find out that explanation. And sometimes there's an explanation, but at other times you can't explain it. And I have to say, that is kind of what My Death ultimately is. I can't give it a rational reading in a way. And all I can say is, there it is. It's the story.
It's strange.
And I would think that if people get involved and if they like, if they're drawn into the story and they believe the voice that's telling them the story, then you just get this kind of, oh, what was that?
Unsettling. And
yes.
That's what I said. For me, because it's the type of literature that I like, I feel comfortable being uncomfortable or feeling uncomfortable or unsettled. I really like this sensation of, there's something wrong here. I can't pinpoint what it is, but this is not. And then I thought about maybe it's something supernatural, but then I thought, not really. It looks like you think you're in front of something supernatural, but I don't think so.
No.
Then I was struggling thinking, okay, if I have to label it, I'm not sure if it's weird, new weird, unsettled, uncanny, maybe all of them and none of them.
Yes.
And maybe it's just a story that runs away from a label. And I like that too.
Oh, good. Well, I sort of think it also kind of, in a way, it falls into a certain category of very short novels that are they might be horrifying or they might just be unsettling or uncanny. But I'm thinking of things like The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or The Portrait of Dorian Gray. These are, and actually they're both, well, Wilde was Irish, but Robert Louis Stevenson was Scottish. And although it's very interesting because although the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is always presented as taking place in London, but I read a essay once which was pointing out that the descriptions of just the way the houses are, this is Edinburgh, where you can go into, you have to walk upstairs sometimes to get from one street to the other, and your back door might lead you out down some stairs into one road, and then when you go out the front door, you're on a different street entirely, which kind of it fits in with the idea of two personalities as well.
There are tours in Edinburgh about, connected to Mr. Jekyll, Dr.
Ghosts and Stevenson, and all those things.
And just trying to wrap up the conversation, I also wanted to ask you about your current project, if you can tell us what you're working on right now.
Well, it is a novel. I got a little bit stuck on it, and then I realized I have to write it. Well, it's too difficult to explain, but it's set in Scotland, but it has a strong fantastical element in it. And it, as in this book, the main characters, there are two women who are the main characters. And you get both of their stories, which don't exactly fit together, but
That's
But
interesting.
they do. Yeah, I don't like to say more than that. And I've written sort of one of the women. Well, I've written half of it, I guess, at this point, and I'm working on the second half now.
So is this the difficult part, trying to see how they will not match?
Yeah, well, yeah, there was a thing too. There's information that I needed to get across too, which neither of the women would necessarily. Well, one of them is writing in first person, the other it's the third person. And I realized there is a story that keeps being referenced that they're looking for. Well, one of the women read it when she was a child, and she's looking for this story. And so I've just had the other woman discover a manuscript of the story. And I realized, oh, I have to write that story now. Yeah. So that kind of brought me to a halt. And so I'm working out that story at the moment. And then I'll be able to get back to the main story once I've done that. So hopefully, maybe I'll finish it this summer. That's my dream.
I also wanted to know, because I was there in Madrid when you met your publisher in Spain from Muñeca Infinita. I would like to know how this story came to be in this publisher. Do they contact you? Or how does this happen?
He contacted the publisher, the one in England. I mean, in New York, New York Review Books. And he contacted them, and they said, "Oh, Lisa has the rights, so you'll have to go directly to her." So he went directly to me, and I agreed. We worked out the contract. He sent me a contract, like more money, but he was like, "Oh, we're a very small press." So okay, that's fine. You love the story. That would be great. But then I heard a funny story. When I was in Barcelona, before I came to Madrid, I met another publisher who was also reading. Oh, he had just bought the book because he'd read a review of it or something. And so he'd ordered a copy in English to read. And it had just arrived, and he'd taken it, and he had it on his table. And his best friend, now this was one publisher. Now his best friend is the publisher from Muñeca Infinita, and they were going to go off to see a football game or something. So he walks in the door, and he goes over and he says, "What are you doing with that book? How do you have that book?" My dad, and because he thought, he said, "I'm publishing it."
Oh, okay. It's
so
funny.
The other publisher said. So at that point, I realized I wasn't going to be able to publish it.
Oh,
so I think it was going to get published in Spain.
Okay.
One way or another.
Of course. Yeah. It was destiny. And were you contacted by the translator or?
I'm just trying to remember because occasionally when I've had things translated, they've needed to ask me like one or two questions. And I said, absolutely. So I can't remember whether she had a question. I just get mixed up because I also had it translated in Italy into Italian. And I remember the translator sent me, she had various questions about, specifically what phrase to use or what I'd meant. And in fact, that was very interesting because she felt rather like you were talking about, feeling you were underlining things that she was saying there are all these strange coincidences with the character in the book and in her own life.
Yes. Yeah.
It's strange.
It's worth reading. I encourage everybody who's watching this to go and read it in Spanish. If you can also in English, it will be a plus. It's very enjoyable. But definitely the version for Muñeca Infinita editorial, it's worth reading. And just to wrap up things, I would like to ask you, who would you like to see in Librisimo if you could invite someone to come to this space? It has to be someone alive.
Yes, that was my first thought, yes. Have you read Kelly Link?
Yes.
The American writer. Yes, okay. I think she's very interesting.
Yeah.
Let me think if there's anyone mysterious. The best thing would be if you could get someone that no one knew what they looked like.
Yeah, that's true.
But is there anyone like that right now?
You're the second person who has suggested Kelly. So definitely I'm going to think about it. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is, What was the last book you read that blew your mind?
Oh dear, my memory is always now. So, what's the last book I read that really blew my mind? Because I'm reading so much for reviewing now.
Yeah, it's true.
And, well, actually, one book that this was last year, was The Book of Bright Doors.
Okay.
I think it was nominated for the Hugo and Nebula. Did it win? I can't remember. But it's so different. It's a fantasy, and I was very, very impressed by that. No, is it called The City of Bright Doors?
Okay.
Right, do you know that? Varya is his first name. His last name's Chandrasekhara, maybe?
Okay. We will look up.
Yeah. I could probably look it up and email it to you.
That will be great. Thank you.
But The City of Bright Doors. And that was terrific. That's a very unusual fantasy.
Great.
But, every few months I read a book that blows my mind.
Of course. Thank you so much.
In between, there's always the
recommendation.
Searching.
We're trying to build a small library of recommendations from everybody who's coming into Librissimo and see what everybody...
I'll probably think of like 4 more that I should have said. But...
I know. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. This was great. I enjoy very much having you over, and I hope that we can read many of your books in Spanish or in English, but in Spanish, that will be great.
More books in Spanish. Well, another book you can read in Spanish, Futuros Perdidos.
Very good. Very good. Do you know the publisher? Who's the publisher?
Yes, Gigamesh.
It's true. We will incorporate this. So this has been great. I can stay here forever talking to you. I know that you're busy, but this is your house. I hope you come again soon with another book in Spanish from maybe the one you're writing.
Maybe the one I'm writing right now. That's my hope.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Good to talk to you. Bye.